We've been working now for a couple of years on really trying to tell the entire history of this incredible game, Dungeons and Dragons, through its visuals, which was a really pretty interesting project. So we're not going to be able to go through the entire 45-year history today, but we do want to give you some highlights of what we've got in the book and some things that we found that I think are really pretty important to this entire movement. Can we get a show of hands before we really kind of get into it of who either plays or has played Dungeons and Dragons or another role-playing game?
Right. Nice. Okay, let's skip
I see
that
why
slide.
this is standing room only.
Right.
Yes.
Good work.
So we can skip this slide, I think.
But we're not skipping this one.
We're not skipping this slide. So Dungeons and Dragons is certainly having a moment right now. The game is as popular as it's ever been, but it hasn't always been this way. So Kyle, you want to talk a little bit about kind of where we are right now, maybe why we are where we are?
There's no denying that Dungeons and Dragons 2018 it's having a zeitgeist moment, the brand, and it's probably the most players it's actively had, and it's growing. 2018 is going to turn out to be the biggest year for the brand. It's already on course for 10% growth, and what's happening now is the entry point for Dungeons and Dragons, because of digital things like YouTube and Twitch, where you can watch somebody play or see how the game is meant to be played with over like a 5-minute clip. Now you can see that that's all it is. The stigmas are stripped away, and we've got to this point where the vernacular and the shorthand about gaming and some of the important principles that were invented by Dungeons & Dragons, leveling up and XP, are all part of our culture already. So in a sense, people have already been playing Dungeons & Dragons, now they're exposed to it, and there's this easy entry point. So it's an exciting time for the brand, I think, for role-playing in general, because it's really about collaborative storytelling and community, and you make a little family and you tell this story together. And in a digital age, there's something wonderful and analog about having that presence with each other, using pencil and paper, and getting together and connecting. So I think there's a nostalgia tied in with escapism and escapism within the narrative. So it's having a wonderful moment.
We like to show this because this game has come a really, really long way. And this is kind of a one-shot. We've got a number of these in the book about really how far this game really, truly has come. And again, this is a way the visuals can really help you see that. Something that was entirely homebrew. That's really kind of very cool. Anyone on this panel like to talk a bit more about what we're looking at here and who that is?
Does anyone not recognize this guy up here?
You guys know what that is, right? Jerk of all jerks, the beholder. Yeah, well, what we were able to unearth is a lot of the interesting inceptions of these very specific and unique monsters. And what surprised me, it didn't surprise John because he's an old pro at this, but for me, it surprised me greatly how young some of the people that Gary Gygax brought in were to try to conceptualize some of these things. If you're like a 14-year-old kid and some old war gamer comes to you and says, I'm going to give you $2 and I need some illustrations and I need them done yesterday, well, what are you going to do? You're going to violate copyright law. Right? I mean, it's the only thing you can do. And I mean, look, we got some Doctor Strange going on up there.
This is issue 167 of Doctor Strange. It was a tandem issue. Strange Tales between Doctor Strange and Nick Fury. And this particular artist seemed to have an affinity for it, and you can see he copied and swiped some of the some of the key images from this book, which translated to very foundational art in the first copy of Dungeons & Dragons.
It's important to appreciate, though, that this was a very open and collaborative fan community when it started, right? This was not something where anybody had any notion that this would be commercially viable, that this would escape from a very tiny audience. And much like with comics fandom, yes, you did swipes. People would take characters and reappropriate them because it wasn't really for commercial purposes. And so what we see in these borrowings, these that are clearly so indebted to Marvel Comics in this instance, it was just the way the community functioned at the time. It really wasn't quite illegal. It's a gray area.
Yeah. Well, and one thing we really love to show when we show things like that is this notion that it was so homebrew. It almost redefines what we understand as homebrew today, right? And there's something kind of cool. There's a cachet about that today. Well, at this time, you're talking about people that were playing a game for themselves, and they were hand assembling this game in their basement to sell to this really small esoteric group of wargamers at the time. And John, you want to talk a little bit about kind of where this all emerged from, this whole notion of role-playing games and D&D?
Some of you may recognize the actor, the elegant English gentleman who is depicted up there in the upper left, a guy by the name of Peter Cushing. Been in Star Wars, a lot of classic like Hammer horror films, things like it. Well, Peter was part of a community, and it was largely an Anglo-American community that collected and painted these military miniatures. And this was a pretty serious historical hobby. People would explore the Napoleonic period. They would want to pay meticulous attention to getting uniform details right and things like it. And Gary Gygax, who was one of the co-creators of D&D, he was a part of this community in the 1960s. You see him depicted there in the lower panel. He's the guy on the right who's kind of closely scrutinizing the scene in front of him. That was a medieval miniature war game, a period recreation of what medieval combat would have been. And that picture is actually from something he called the Lake Geneva War Games Convention, which is a little group of friends he had. Over about 96 people made it to this con, which was a block away from his house.
About this many people.
Yeah, about this many people. Made it, and it was at this horticultural hall, a place they did flower shows. It was about a block away from his house in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Today, of course, that convention has continued since then. We now just call it Gen Con for short. And the ones we have now in Indianapolis draw 60,000 plus people. This is a pretty big deal at this point. But it was at this time in '68 that Gary got really interested in medieval miniature war games. And so he teamed up with another guy, Jeff Perrin, who lived in Rockford, Illinois, nearby. And actually Greg Bell, the kid that we saw doing those illustrations from Marvel Comics, he was part of Jeff's circle there. And they put out this pamphlet called Chainmail, which, as you can see, is rules for medieval miniatures. And these kinds of things, usually you share these kinds of miniatures rules. They develop through fanzines that would determine, okay, what does combat mean when you have like this kind of soldier versus this kind of soldier, and what are the odds that things will hit, and how many people get killed by arrows or boiling oil or whatever, and you roll dice to determine that. The interesting thing about Chainmail, though, is that the final third of that booklet was reserved for something they called the fantasy supplement. And there really had been no fantasy wargaming products before this. And it detailed how you would fight with orcs and elves. It had wizards who could cast fireball and lightning bolt.
Could I ask you, what did wargamers at the time think of the fantasy supplement?
They weren't usually crazy about it. These guys who, again, were really focused on exploring history through these miniatures looked down on it. It was childish. You're playing with fairy tales. It was very controversial. But it caught on with a few people. And one of the people it caught on with is the gentleman you see there to the left, whose name is Dave Arneson. Now, Gary and Dave had, in 1970, been a part of a group they called the Castle and Crusade Society. And this was a small club. It was never larger than 80 people, who largely connected up by post. They sent around a fanzine they called the Domesday Book. And the map you see behind them there is from the 9th issue of the Domesday Book, and it shows an imaginary land that Gary had devised called the Great Kingdom. And Dave Arneson had a parcel of this. He was a baron in their society, so he was the baron of an area called Blackmore. And Dave used these chainmail rules to start exploring kind of the fantasy dimensions of this in Blackmore, including dungeon exploration. Although chainmail had wizards and fighters, he added a cleric class to it. And also added to it this notion that you might be able to go up in level, gain experience points as you kill things. And so he and Gary started corresponding about it, and that process ultimately led up to what you see there on the left, which is the cover of the first draft of Dungeons and Dragons, which we reproduce in the book.
And you can see here we've got a couple of fun panels, actually one of which that does not make the original draft of Dungeons and Dragons, the other that does. The beautiful which you will actually find in those original pamphlets that very few people have today, of course. This was a very small production. But one thing I always like to point out with things like what they call the ugly witch there in that panel by Cookie Corey. She writes this little note to Gary that says, hey, I'm trying to figure this out, help. Here's a draft panel from a game that was as homebrew as you get, and it was never used. It's a miracle it still survives today, if you think about it. They didn't know they were making history when they made it. This is that draft piece of paper that's on your desk that you scribble something on and throw away because it wasn't good enough. And finding things like that was particularly interesting, and it told you a little bit different story about how this all really came together.
And it's fascinating that Cookie Corey, again a female artist, half of the artists who worked on the original D&D illustrations were female.
And what's important about that previous panel, the map, the Great Kingdom, that was the first shared universe. And these guys were communicating either in person at a convention or pen pals. and they would say, oh, this castle has been sieged, or this village has been ransacked, and they would have to mark it down on their map. And in the pre-internet days, that was the only way to have this shared universe.
Sort of
but
an early
it's
World of
precursory
Warcraft.
to everything that people find interesting now in gaming.
And sending a letter off that tells someone that a character's been killed is a little bit slower than dial-up. Trust me.
So we finally get to a point here, kind of emerging from this wargaming lineage, where they publish a game. They self-publish a game. And there it is, what we call in the space the brown box. Hand-assembled by Gary Gygax, his partners, and his family in 1974. And this becomes fairly popular in the space. But by popular, what I mean really is that it becomes popular in the wargaming community. People really like it, they're interested in it, and I will tell you, if you read these original rules, it's incomprehensible to just about anybody else. Even today, if you're a role-playing gamer, you will read these rules and say, what in the hell is he talking about? But again, it does catch on in this little space. And of course, because this game is this interesting do-it-yourself fantasy builder for everybody, for whatever reason, it really captures the imagination of this group, and they start writing about it. They start developing their own campaigns. It's the ultimate viral type of mechanism to put into people's hands. And this catches on pretty quick. By 1975, the game is going very well. And they actually are invited to a convention in Baltimore called the Origins Convention, which is alive and well today. You may have been to Origins. This is Origins 1 in Baltimore. And Origins has asked Gary to put on a tournament for this radical new game called Dungeons & Dragons. And Gary brings a couple of his staff members to be co-DMs with him. And he built something called the Tomb of Horrors. Has anyone ever heard of the Tomb of Horrors?
Who's played the Tomb of Horrors? Raise your hand if you played the Tomb of Horrors. Oh, you're so sheepish. Look at this. The fear is still with you after all these years. Did anyone survive the Tomb of Horrors? Thank you.
You're the first
Thank you.
honest
First
people
audience that
seen.
tell the
first
truth.
Honest
Honest people.
No one survives.
No one survives the Tomb of Horrors. This is universally known as the most deadly, maybe unfair adventure in Dungeons and Dragons.
In the
history.
novel Ready Player One, it was the first obstacle in Ernie Klein's book, and although it didn't make the movie, the iconography right there you see in the,
Facing the Great Green Devil.
bottom, right? That's all over the third act, graffitied on the van they drive around. So they tried to keep the homage alive, but it is known as the ultimate challenge for a gamer.
Well, and it needed to be such a challenge because the way they ran this as a tournament, right? They needed to find winners. And so you would go into a party of 15. These were huge parties. Remember, this is only 16 months after the game has come out. Maybe 1,500 copies have been sold. A lot of Xerox copies, but 1,500 have been sold at this point. Most people who went into this in Origins that year had never been played before, right? This was their introduction. Welcome to Dungeons & Dragons.
You died.
Enjoy the Tomb of
And to
Horrors.
survive it, you had to often bring hirelings or in-laws to send into the room in front of you.
Right.
In-laws?
And
Either or.
people to sacrifice that would touch the wall and absorb the poison. And it was the kind of thing where it wasn't your character's life on the line. You found ways to probe the dungeon.
So what we're looking at here, this is Gary's hand-drawn map of the tomb itself. And what happened is, we're talking about a tournament, you know? It's competitive. You have all these different groups, and they're all running concurrent. There are different dungeon masters running each group. So Gary knew, because up until now, what is he doing? He's selling rules. And the rules have little illustrations to sort of make things a little bit more specific, but that's about as far as it goes. 1,000 copies, cool, some Xerox machines, some bootlegs, whatever. But Gary understands going into this tournament. Wow, the way I'm describing the tournament is almost like Karate Kid.
It is like Karate Kid. This is
the best. Sorry. So he knows going into this tournament, he needs some help because he's going to have several dungeon masters who are not him, running different groups all at the same time, all with these timed challenges and these huge groups. They all need to be reacting to the same stuff. So, he brings on 14-year-old Tracy Lesh to start making these illustrations. You can see the prototypical version of the Great Green Devil right here. Tracy Lesh is this 14-year-old kid who's making all of these very, very specific illustrations so that, why? Why is he doing this? To spruce it up? No, for no other reason then the dungeon master for each of these tournament groups has to be able to present the same information to each group. And what's the easiest? Well, a picture is worth 1,000 words.
It's to standardize the experience,
exactly.
so you could actually run it as a legitimate competition, so each group experienced the same thing.
These are the graphics to the game that Gary designed, right? Now, so suddenly, there becomes a little bit more pressure in terms of, well, we really need art, don't we? We really need to be pushing this artistic thing. We need to instruct people what is happening in this room. We need to instruct people what is the challenge that is placed before you. And so as the game continues on in prominence. And by the way, what my brother is holding here is really quite special. This is the tournament version of Gary's Tomb of Horrors. This is not the published version, the one that killed
From
you, sir.
1978.
They're not responsible. Well, they're partially responsible. They're definitely responsible. But look, it's not them. It's different because this is different. These are different illustrations that lead to the illustrations that you were shown before you died. These are different illustrations.
Yeah.
You get Gary's handwritten notes in here. You get references to rules that never...
Characters like the Mystic.
Yeah, things that didn't quite
Reference.
make it into the game. And it is our great privilege to have been able to reproduce this for the special edition of our
Yeah,
Art
so
and
you
Arcana.
can
its
play it
entirety.
and die in it.
Excellent.
Yeah, so that this too can kill you.
Yeah.
What's important about this early art, and you see it's a lot of it's hand-drawn, black and white, color hasn't been introduced yet, and its purpose is function. It's like a cave painting. Or like pottery. It has a purpose. It's not to blow you away with cinematic landscape. It's not to transport you somewhere else. It's there to tell you how the game can be played, because this is a totally customizable experience. And so this early art, what's fascinating is it has the hand-drawn quality is there, and they haven't introduced the budget yet to it. And we're going to get to this. Technicolor finally is introduced into the game at a certain point once it starts selling copies because they have an art budget.
So we're now 2 years into the game, so we'll only be 6 to 8 hours more if you have the time today. So things like this though were really pretty meaningful to us. I mean, I don't want to certainly talk about our personal story too much, only to say that things like Tomb of Horrors are iconic in the brand, but we never actually realized the visual relevance of Tomb of Horrors until we started looking at this visual history through that lens. And so that was pretty cool to actually discover some really new things.
By the way, for new players, Tomb of Horrors has added significance in that recently they put out Tomb of Annihilation, which is a continuation of all of that.
As well as the Yawning
danger.
Portal, the last challenge in that is a reproduction of the Tomb of Horrors for 5th
So
edition.
yeah, they keep coming back
So
to this really
Sarac,
iconic.
the nostalgia is still alive, looking back to these previous things that were so landmark in the game, and that's another reason why 5th edition is so successful, because it's pulling off of all this history rather than supplanting it with something new.
So the game starts selling copies, and it does start to really grow in these really niche hobby channels. But again, we're still very much in a small space, and I want to really reiterate that. But the game starts to make some money. And in an associated fashion, they start producing a little bit better materials. They start creating beginner and basic box sets. And more importantly, they start to hire real artists that have a little bit of art training to do their work, not just local teenagers they could find that would work for $2 a panel. And you start to see some illustrated panels that are in color. And then, of course, end of 1977, beginning of 1978, they start on this line called the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons line. What's notable about, well, there's a lot of things notable about it we won't get into today, but these are hardcover books that are very high quality. They have full color covers, and we're actually really pleased in our book to bring you actually the original native paintings of the wraparound covers for the first time that have ever been published.
Now, when we got together to make this, there's 4 of us here, and we're saying, why did it take 4 people to do this? We got together and we said we don't want to just make a visual history book where it's just images. There's a story here. There's a juxtaposition magic that happens when you put 2 images together. And we wanted to also present native art. And there were 5 key images that we sought. And up until the last day, even after the book was closed and ready to go to the printer, we said, open it up, because this one came into our lap. But like the previous one, you see like the spider in the tree was covered by spine and trade dress put up there. So be able to present this in its full glory, to see the brushstroke, to see the color quality, to remove it from the low quality printing process that they had back then and actually photograph it new. And each time we'd find something, and John spearheaded a lot of this, we'd find something that would lead to 3 or 10 more images that we wanted to include. So we wanted this to be a book that was not just art, but ephemera and toys and animation cells and belt buckles and color forms and anything that the way the brand was visualized. And so these, though, are the key images, I think, in the book, seeing this brand in its full glory back in this era.
So at this point, again, the game really is doing very well, but it is not destined for the mainstream. And I would, if I had to say, I mean, I don't know what would have happened otherwise, but what I would say is that this game would have never come to the mainstream if not for a really weird particular incident that no one could have ever planned for. In 1979,
James Dallas Egbert III. He's a 16-year-old college student. 16 years old at college, you can imagine. That must have been very difficult for him. He disappears at some point. And the family is very worried. They hire a private investigator named William Deere, who comes to the campus, checks out the guy's dorm room, looks around, finds these strange books that he can't really make head nor tails of, this thing called Dungeons and Dragons, and it's got devil faces on the cover and stuff like that. And he's looking through it, and he's reading it, and he's seeing these maps, strange mazes. He's asking around, someone's, hey, are there any like mazes around here? Oh, there's steam tunnels. There's steam tunnels underneath the game. Wait a second. I know what happened here. I know what happened to James Dallas III. I think that he played this strange game, and he played it too well. He played it so long that he became confused between reality and fantasy, between am I me or am I my character? And I think James Dallas Egbert, he wandered down to the steam tunnels, which are the very same, very similar thing to the maps in the game, and he's probably wandering down right there. He probably even killed himself. I think that's what happened, and suddenly this makes national news. Dungeons and Dragons is now everywhere. People are talking about it. This game that drove this kid insane, caused him to go off down into these steam tunnels and kill himself. And in the meantime, James Dallas Egbert, he just ran away. He was fine. Had nothing to do with D&D. He was just under a lot of pressure.
And there was no corrective follow-up.
No corrective follow-up, because that's not a very good story, right? Like, he's fine. Anyway.
so this game that was selling in hobby catalogs all of a sudden is in the New York Times. Okay, so while the story does resolve itself in about a month's time, and as they suggested, no one ever comes back and retracts, oh, by the way, all that stuff was nonsense, all this bizarre cult talk, all of this confusion between reality and fantasy, it's all nonsense. No one bothers really doing that, or very few people do. But now you've got parents that are looking, that are interested. Oh, but my kid plays that. Let me go take a look. And they see things like this on the cover.
Right.
Which nobody had noticed until recently, the amazing thong on that demon. We didn't even notice it until we were able to look at this image so big.
For the first time, we reproduced the demon thong as it's never before been seen.
So John, what happens from here now that there's a new scrutiny on this game that was otherwise just kind of in the shadows before?
Oh, well, obviously sales quadrupled. I mean, why wouldn't it? So yeah, once this got this mainstream attention, people started buying it, and that additional scrutiny, obviously once these sorts of images, parents became aware of what was in them, this created controversy. But also, the news cycle, once it stopped talking about James Dallas Egbert, that got Gary Gygax on Tom Snyder's Tomorrow, which was a big show at the time, right? It got articles in Newsweek. They were no longer really about the James Dallas Egbert thing. But from that, again, it completely transformed the brand into the most unlikely thing that could have happened. And with it came mainstream attention. Now, that mainstream attention included a nice contract with Random House, who happens to be our publisher as well. Random House started distributing this. But of course, because of this pressure and this concern, and also it looked demographically like younger and younger people were buying it, they needed to really redo their image a bit. The devils and thongs and things like that probably weren't what Random House wanted to see in Walden books,
Not
say.
really.
And so one of the things we love about this book, I love advertisements. Advertisements bring you back into the moment so quickly, so do catalogs and things like that. These are catalogs here, side by side, from 1981 and 1982. 1981, the gateway to adventure looks like a pretty scary place, actually. I love the septum piercing for the door knocker, but the demon tail, everything looks really scary. The adventure looks like it might actually not be for kids. Fast forward to 1982, and it's Morley, the happy wizard. Come into my room where there's treasure and games and fun. And this is very much, what the brand became then, right? They got, first of all, because they had so much more money, they got much better artists, they got much better public relations teams and marketing teams, and then they got much better artists.
But there's still this stigma that's attached to the brand. And,
Forever fused with this heavy
forever
metal
fused.
energy.
There's mothers that want to form a group called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. Bad.
King devil worship.
That's right. The most trusted face of our generation, Mr. Tom Hanks,
Yep,
right
there he
here,
is.
plays in a
There he is.
made-for-TV movie by CBS called Mazes and Monsters, which is about the fact that Dungeons and Dragons does, it's not ambiguous, it does drive your children insane. And Tom Hanks has a real Oscar-winning moment at the end when he realizes that he's insane.
It's a must-watch.
Yeah, it's on YouTube somewhere, I think.
And it finds its way into the mainstream. This is Steven Spielberg's E.T. from 1982, and Spielberg's filming this movie in 1981. And what's in the zeitgeist? What are teens playing, and what's got an edge to it? He's trying to authenticate and ground the movie to endear it to teens and children. And Dungeons and Dragons provides him that. It gives it that energy and authenticity. So you can see it in the movie here in a very early scene just before Elliot meets E.T. And an interesting footnote, you can see it on YouTube, is the end of the movie was supposed to be bookended by Elliot finally graduating to the Dungeon Master's chair, and he's actually leading the group and the older brother and his friends through the dungeon. So you can see that Dungeons & Dragons was supposed to have more of a central place in the narrative, and it's a really nice bookend. But here, what its purpose was to really show what teens were up to in 1982, and that's one of its more famous pop culture examples.
And you think about this domino effect, and so sometimes people ask us, so does D&D make the mainstream without what they call the satanic panic, this whole kind of controversy we're talking about? And the answer is I don't know. But I think it's safe to say that it's not an E.T. by 1982 if it hasn't showed up in the mainstream circa 1980.
We can thank the worst private detective of all time, William Deere, for the success of Dungeons & Dragons.
So now we've got money. Now we're on the shelves of Walden Books. Now we've grown from about a company with $2 million of revenue a year to $30 million of revenue a year in about a 4-year span. So things are actually going quite well. And now you can hire some really well-seasoned, trained artists, some of the best actually in the fantasy business. And that's kind of what starts happening from here. Does anyone know, anyone grow up on the red box, what we call the red box in the space?
Nice.
One of the most famous, not only the most famous products in gaming history, but of course some of the most famous art. We're showing off a little bit here by being able to find some draft art of some really iconic imagery. As you can see here, you've got some variations in this early Larry Elmore version of the red box cover. We've got a lot of things like that in the book that we.
This is a real gateway piece between the old 70s stuff and the direction the brand is going. And that's one of the reasons why it ends up on our cover, because it has this very cinematic, immersive entry point, and you feel like you're right there with the fighter. And it's one of those ones that survived multiple generations, and even up until recently, they've recycled it.
Oh, I mean, it was on pinball machines, it was on wallets, like that piece of art appeared everywhere. And the game was inspiring so many people by this point because it would reach such a wide audience, people who became really, really, really into D&D. One of them was a guy named Ed Greenwood, actually, who developed this campaign world that he called the Forgotten Realms. And he had written something like 11,000 pages of material for this. By the late 1980s, D&D, I guess the people at TSR had decided they wanted to be more in the story business, to be building not just kind of a set of rules, but very much worlds that they could exploit, not just through game products like modules, but to take to novels, to calendars, to computer games.
Animation.
Even.
Yeah.
Animation. And so what you see up here is Ed Greenwood's original map of the Sword Coast of the Forgotten Realms that includes places you may have heard of, like, say, Waterdeep or Baldur's Gate, or take your pick, Neverwinter Nights. So as soon as really they conceived of this transmedia direction, we start to see games like Pool of Radiance become ambassadors for the D&D brand. D&D no longer is merely a tabletop phenomenon. And this is something we felt was very important to show. Again, we talk a lot about all the kind of ancillary things of D&D we like to show in this. Things like computer games at this time started to get close to what the sales were like for the base game books. At this time, the Player's Handbook might sell 400,000 copies, say, but Pool of Radiance now could sell 250,000 copies. And we love showing how you can see the little kobold figure in Pool of Radiance copies so directly from that kobold from the monster manual. These kinds of things just get us in touch with the roots of this. But if you fast forward another decade, right, to Baldur's Gate, by the time Baldur's Gate comes out, it's selling 2 million copies, right? And then Baldur's Gate 2 sells another 2 million copies. And a lot of these campaign worlds they developed, Planescape is my personal favorite of these. That was well received in the community, but Planescape Torment, the computer game, is why everyone knows Planescape, because it's commonly rated as one of the best RPGs of all time.
And so these digital versions of the game become the overriding and dominant visualization of it for mass audiences. So you're seeing the brand's identity shift a bit as the marketplace is shifting, and it introduces competitors as well, because D&D's been around for a bit, and now other people are inspired to create role-playing games through the open gaming license, and people that grew up on it now are game designers. So the marketplace is more crowded, and Dungeons & Dragons is also publishing other realms. So they're competing against themselves too. And then you have the influx of digital games.
So there's one thing we really like to show and in the book, and one thing that became clear to us. Now, a lot of us have studied, we've all played this game our whole lives, and we've studied this game for a long time at a pretty in-depth level. But there are certain things you will just never see if you do not look at the game through the visual lens. And one of them is something like this. Again, this little image here talks about all the different campaigns that TSR was rolling out in the 1990s. And you can see how confused the brand actually had become. It was trying to create something for everyone.
Buck Rogers is...
We even got Buck Rogers in there for some reason. Really, we do. There's so many interesting stories you see when you start looking at the game in this way. We studied things like how the game had been inspired by pulp art. That's a picture from the very famous Brom there from D&D. From D&D's art stable, and how he was inspired by Frank Frazetta, as was everyone else from the famous Conan covers.
But the art needed to be eclectic to sell it, so you'd have more whimsical, fantasy, sci-fi, spelljammer. You'd have very brutal and violent and grounded Dark Sun with psionics, and had a Mad Max feel. And the art told you the direction that you could creatively take this world with the same basic rule set. So the art was the main communicating factor in this that sold it for everyone.
So this little panel here I think is pretty fun. And again, there's a lot we could talk about, safe to say. But what we like to show here is this idea that when the 90s, there's this little game called Magic the Gathering is born. And it creates something we know as the collectible card gaming space. And it actually, again, it's the same bucket of money for most hobby gamers. Those people that were playing D&D previously start shifting their money over to Magic the Gathering. If you were buying a module before, now you're buying a booster pack. So it starts to eat the lunch of the entire hobby gaming space, even though it's a different type of game. And what you see TSR doing, the creator of D&D, is that they start following suit. They start trying to enter the CCG space themselves with Spellfire. They start reacting to a lot of market trends. Well, we need newer and younger players to enter the space. How do we get them? How do we indoctrinate young players? And so we like to show little things like this, which is an ad. It actually comes from an ad at the time. You know, that's about a 4 or 5 year period where these are all different basic and beginner sets. They're rolling out on an annual basis to try to figure out how can we get new players into space. So there's the basic beginner introductory set. Here's the basic, newly revised so-and-so. They're trying to find a way to explain this game to people, still.
It's so interesting that that's an ad, right? They're just kind of like, confused about D&D? Well, how about more confusion?
Here's 8 tries at being not confused.
Do you find now? Good, great. But it's interesting to note that at this point the brand had become a little bit, while it was doing some great things, there was some insecurity there for perhaps the first time, because D&D, being the first role-playing game, could stride boldly forward with no thought as to what any competitor was doing, because they were the only game in town. And then when there were competitors, well, the competitors weren't as big as they were, so they didn't bother to, they didn't care what anyone else was doing. They were D&D, and they were going to be D&D. But then by the time you get here, it starts looking at different marketplaces, including, for example, video games,
Yep.
right? It starts going, what are all those millions of kids playing over there? World of Warcraft. But that's just D&D. Well, that's not. Oh, come on. You can do better than that. Don't sit here in front of your computer all sad, looking sad. Don't play computer games. What are you, a loser with your computer games? Also play our computer game, though, because we're going to make one even better than the one that you are playing. And also, by the way, your books, they are no good to you anymore, sir. Just use them to prop your computer up and play our computer game. You're just like, wow.
So the story of advertising tells the schizophrenia. And D&D wasn't just looking over its shoulder. It was trying to catch up or be forever replaced. And it was a dangerous time for the brand. And what's fascinating is there have been so many times when the brand has been on the brink of disaster and doom, and how it's been resurrected. And I think that's what's so wonderfully traced with these ads. Sometimes you don't have to write this stuff in the book. The juxtaposition of images tells you what's going on and how they're trying to figure out what they are and how they can survive and sell it.
And so all of a sudden the game starts to look like those very digital games they're trying to now emulate and follow. They're
It's
trying
like
to
a
capture this audience.
Fantasy Busby Berkeley musical here. They're jamming everything they can into the frame, and this guy's got an impossibly large sword, and everybody looks like they're doing something absolutely heroic, and the isometric angles, and there's a total video game emulation going on here. The game had become more complex, and it's also really a complex minis game at this point.
It's wonderful to be able to reproduce things like this,
Yeah.
the last image, in its full glory like this. And we're so grateful to Wizards of the Coast, right, for having given us just unprecedented access to their archives for these kinds of things.
Seattle based. Well, Renton, close, right? Yeah, now we get to this point where the game has now been following the market for a while. And they see there's literally 10x number of players playing digital games, digital versions of their game and their concept, than what are playing their tabletop games. So what starts happening in the market as they start building these more and more complex tabletop versions of digital games?
So there's a bit of a backlash, you might say. There's a bit of a retro movement. And you increasingly see, again, them trying to tap back into an audience that had gone back to the original principles of this. There's something they call the old school Renaissance that's out there, which is a bunch of players and collectors. And I'm part of this collecting community, I guess, that has helped kind of restore originalist approaches to D&D. And I should...
Retro clones and all kinds of crazy
all kinds
stuff
of things
out
like
there. Retro
that.
clone is like a clone of an old rule set, so that if you loved D&D in 1982, you could play that version of D&D.
And, I think that created some anxiety as well at Wizards of the Coast. And so you see, for example, this starter set, which is from around 2008 or so, if I had to guess. And this really looks just like the Red Box from 1983. They're reminding people, hey, again, you can probably not even tell the difference, right, looking at this in this room. Hey, this box, it's still the same game, we promise, even though now we're on a 4th edition, and these are, very different rules mechanically, very miniatures driven in a way that the 1983 version was not.
So Wizards takes this to heart. Wizards, of course, is now the owner of Dungeons & Dragons, has been now for, 15 years.
Subsidiary of Hasbro.
Subsidiary of Hasbro. And they take this to heart and they realize, who are we? What are we trying to be? Are we a video game producer? Are we trying to do nothing but follow the video game space? And they go through a massive playtest called D&D Next. It's actually the largest role-playing game test in the history of the world.
100,000.
Which, by the way, speaking of retro clones, included the design team playing through every version of the Dungeons & Dragons rules going all the way back to the early 70s, literally acknowledging that they needed to reconnect with the roots of the game.
I think it's a very healthy and honest thing. They didn't just say we're a new team of people, we're going to go take the game forward in our own way. Let's go back and be truthful about what worked. And let's look what's in the DNA and why these elements have survived through iterations. Why is the game still around? There's a reason. So let's cull those elements and let's see what people respond to and what resonates visually and narratively. And let's see how we can alchemically weave it into something special that doesn't crush what came before it, but can stand on its shoulders and still honor the past. And I think that's what's so wonderful about 5th edition is the simplicity and the inclusiveness of it, and you can actually, finally, with 3 onward, 3.5 onward, you could start to, the barriers were broken in terms of what classes you could play. Could a half-orc be a paladin? But now anybody in any class and any gender could be any type of character. So it was a completely blank slate, and yet if you played all these other games, it was even richer.
Moreover, it just took everything that was great about each edition and put it all into one pot and let you decide how you wanted to play the game. Me and Kyle are doing this book because we fell back in love with D&D because of 5e. So
that's kind of how it came about.
It
It's
really
strange.
is.
It's a really strange story. I got back into playing, and Stan was my Star Wars game master, and we were in this great game, and he had to go off to work, and I didn't want to start another Star Wars game, and I had played Dungeons & Dragons on and off my whole life, so I got back into D&D. Within a week or two, I was going on eBay and Amazon to find where's the book. Where's the book about everything I've missed in the past few years? And it really didn't exist. And I read Michael's book, Empire of Imagination, and was hooked. And I knew him through Facebook, and I knew he was Sam's brother, so I reached out and said, hey, do you want to do a book? And he was like, yeah, and it just started to pick up momentum. And Michael immediately suggested John, and I knew of John's book and how esteemed he was as a historian and collector. And then the group grew, and Sam's like, you're doing a book with my brother? How do you
It was
know my brother?
initial betrayal that sent you off.
And so we
looking
formed
for a new
this
game.
balanced party to go do it. And I think it wouldn't have been what it was unless we all brought our experiences and our unique perspectives to this, to tell it in a prismatic way and look at it healthily from all these different angles to organically write a unified history of the game. Because if one of us had done it, it would have been so different and limited.
Limited. Everyone has a different take on this game, and we all should. But much like we believe the new version of the game is very inclusive, we needed to include different perspectives, and it wasn't just us four. We also interviewed countless people who had worked on the games.
We found an artist's personal favorites, which was often enlightening to find out, oh, that was your favorite? What?
Talked to fans, old and new. The new fans that I talked to were the most enlightening, I think, to me.
Well, and we had a tremendous amount of support from the community doing this as
there's
well.
no
I mean,
question.
when I mentioned we had such great access to Wizards' stuff, I mean, unfortunately, before Wizards acquired TSR in 1997, a lot of that material just ended up being scattered to the 9 winds. These early pieces of art, these early kind of drafts of the game, they just ended up in the hands of private collectors. And fortunately, we know a lot of those people, and they've been profoundly useful to
Oh my
us
gosh,
in putting this together.
incredible. So at the end of the day, we started with this notion that D&D is having a moment right now. And the question we tried to ask even when we started our project is why? And the why, I think, is pretty clear. You've got this beautiful, elegant new rule set that's for everyone. And the barriers to accessibility have been broken. Because now, where in the 90s they had to build new starter sets every year to help people understand what the hell this game was, now you can go on YouTube and you can watch 5 minutes of Matt Mercer or somebody else like him playing a game of Dungeons & Dragons. You can understand instantly what the game is about, how easy it is to play, and you can go start your own game with your friends. And I think that's one reason why we're all sitting here today.
Yeah.
So we would love to take some questions, and I know we don't have a lot of time. Sage will kill me if we go too far over.
Ask questions.
So I know we have to sign books too, and we promise we will. We'll stay as long as you want us to do that.
Why don't you mop
So
the shirt, Kyle?
let's take some questions, and we've got shirts.
But after you ask a question, if we call you up, just come up, see Michael, and we'll try and get you shirt size if we have it.
Okay, let's start with this gentleman right here.
Yeah, I'm curious. I know there were some other role-playing games that were created in the 80s. Do you know how much of that, if any, was driven by the panic over Dungeons and Dragons itself? Because I ask that because I have a specific memory. My friends and I, we couldn't play at my friend Phil's house because his mother totally bought into it. But she bought him to placate him. Bought him a role-playing game based on the Sicilian Mafia, which is in no way racist.
Well, she should have gotten him Dragon Raid, right, which is the Christian
very
one.
clear memory of sitting at his kitchen table, 3 of us plotting the hit of a guy while she's over there making dinner. Dungeons and Dragons.
So the question is,
Yeah.
largely, how did the Satanic Panic affect the industry?
Right.
How did it affect other games?
Games that existed because of the Satanic Panic.
Yep. Well, I mean, I can say this before you give the correct answer. I will say that our Dungeons and Dragons collection was destroyed by our mother because it's the devil.
It's true.
So we played Star Wars.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
No, I mean, it's certainly true. I mean, in no small part, again, just because of the prominence of D&D after the Satanic Panic, everyone wanted to cash in on it. So that it wasn't merely just reacting against the potentially occult elements of it, but just the fact it had become so prominent. But of course, again, by 1976, there were already role-playing games about bunnies and burrows. And there were, there was Traveler by 1977. There's a whole gamut of genres that were explored. Top Secret by 1980, right? So I think that it had already leapt away from those potentially occult trappings long before there had been any panic. But the panic definitely made everyone think there's actually money in this now.
They actually created a new market, so people were bound to compete.
You next. And if you want to come up for a shirt, the last gentleman that asked the question, if you want to come up for a shirt, I can.
I appreciate that. I have already more shirts than I know.
Oh, good. Then more for everyone else then. You, please.
Did your mother ever apologize? Did someone ever come back later to the FBI and go, did you ever realize how much of a difference you made in how big this got?
How much he's enriched all of our lives by bringing Dungeons and Dragons to the masses. Mother has apologized, yes.
Yeah, no, she's very supportive,
We just
extremely.
wrote a book about it, so she's like,
No, I will say this. You have to understand the context of, these are parents that get this game that is so weird. It has demons on the front. It has spells inside. This is a really, really frightening thing for, if your 8-year-old is playing this game in the 1980s where there's a lot of media attention around this topic. And of course, the Satanic Panic, of course, is a much broader popular culture topic. It was not just for role-playing games, right? This stretched into satanic cults and all kinds of places.
Yeah,
so
it was cult recruiting for cults and stuff. But what is
As for Deere, though, William Deere, the private investigator, not only did he not apologize, he really doubled down. Like, he wrote a book about this. He was trying to get movies made about his side of the story of this. It was, he ended up working with the people like Bad,
to defend the parents that threw away D&D books. There was a 60-minute special where they said, and very credibly, they're like, do you know what role-playing is really for? It's for behavioral modification. We are redesigning our personalities. Ask these kids what D&D is, and they're like, well, yeah, you kill these guys, you take their stuff. And they're like, look at this. You see? This is what we want to teach our children to do.
Yeah, Tom Radecki, whose name some of you might know, who was later a big critic of video game violence, and I understand had a somewhat ignominious end. He was one of the many enablers, I guess, who was trying to provide a veneer of science around some of this. So it was a very unfortunate time.
this gentleman right there.
So this is obviously a very comprehensive book, but is there anything that didn't quite make the cut that you each have a personal?
There was thousands of images, and I'll say this is a curated collection. Like, we were the board of the museum, and we had to meet and discuss what we were going to include. There's so much that was on the cutting room floor, but that was the beauty of it. We had to just say not just what was the prettiest, because sometimes you take the ugliest piece and you show it big. It was what was the most disruptive, transformative, what had people never seen. Like page 40 is the big eye, and that's the precursor to the beholder, and it's actually more like a roper rooted to the ground, and it clearly says on the side in handwritten note, don't use, no. That's in the book, so we wanted to have room for that and not just, all the pretty art.
So you talked a little bit about the open game license and that contribution, kind of how the community grew. I was curious if you had any opinions about kind of the future forward-looking, since they shifted off the OGL for 4th edition onward, whether it's like constricting the community or if it's like controlling the brand to keep it more consistent.
I mean, there's Adventures League, and so there's a variety of ways that they're inviting the community to participate and publish and be a part of the
Drive-through
brand.
RPG lets you self-publish.
I mean, they effectively put out an SRD, right, for 5th edition as well, that you can just download if you just want the basic rules. I think that's what they call it. So, I think they have made precisely the same style of outreach. It's just, it isn't licensed quite the same way that was originally, and there's a lot of complexity around the different ways that they choose to license it, but it seems like people really like, actually, the opportunities they're being given that contribute to the brand under the rubric of 5th Ed now.
Sage, can we have 3 more questions? Is that too much?
I think we can do that. Sure.
Okay. You, sir.
So you brought up heavy metal briefly during the Satanic Panic, how that correlated with all this. However, I at PAX went to a panel hosted by Adam Coble, who was Sage's own collaborator for Dungeon World, and Luke Crane, who talked about the history of heavy metal with respect to the origins of Dungeons and Dragons, and didn't actually find much history there amongst the actual creators. However, yet it's so clearly fused, at least within my childhood in the 90s, of D&D and metal, 100% of the time, all the time. So how, when you were going through this whole history, did you find a lot with the more modern artists, some of the artists from, say, the mid-80s, etc., who were really largely part of both these communities, and how much these things have interleaved over the years?
So Luke actually reached out to me before that panel, I remember, and was asking me if I could you got to see these to get it.
This is kind of an example of how metal and D&D have coalesced, and this is, of course, the brainchild of Joe Manganiello, who does these shirts called Death Saves. You've probably all seen them on Colbert.
D&D streetwear, you got some nice Gamma World logo up there.
So you want to rethink if you want a t-shirt?
Yeah, how do you feel about it?
It's pretty good.
But so to your point, this is certainly these were peanut butter and jelly somehow.
What's the name of the guy who did the Kiss cover?
Oh, yes. So Ken Kelly, we have this great panel in the book. It's a painting that is from an LJN box art from some of the toys.
He also did Micronauts.
That was provided by a wonderful collector who's hugely helpful in this project named Billy Galaxy in Portland. And he had the original painting of this LJN box art. It was by Ken Kelly, who had been hired by LJN to do it. Ken Kelly was the same guy who did Love Gun, the Love Gun cover for Kiss. So these things really were, it's kind of the same community of people that were involved in it, who were doing the art, that were creating the visuals, and they all kind of went together.
But it wasn't internally. It wasn't like TSR at the time was doing that. I think it was something that happened at home. And in your bedroom, people were starting to put it like peanut butter and chocolate.
Yeah, these were chess pieces that were placed on the board by Satan himself to sort of. Yeah, there you go.
Let's see, I think we have 2 more before they kill us. So you, sir, right there. The beard. No, yes, you.
You do have a beard, sir. Hey, you weren't aware.
In Magic the Gathering, there was like a push in the late 90s to make the game more like, this is 4 bullets, and we're going to take all that sort of art we did in the early 90s with all the women in it, and no, it's all going to be chainmail bikinis from here on out. Was there a similar like reaction sort of phase in D&D where they pushed against sort of, and then swung back the other way?
I mean, so I think when Wizards acquired TSR and did 3rd edition, there was a very decided push to be more inclusive and to show figures like, they had these iconic characters they used to represent the classes. The monk class was represented by Ember, who's a female, was a woman of color. And, I think they really made a big push around it then, and they also made a push to try to make armor look more like it would look in Universe if it were real, which was kind of a reaction against the more high fantasy-ish art of the 1980s. So, I mean, I think since then they've been pretty good about this stuff, right? I mean, certainly 5th, these people have absolutely no patience. People like Mike Merles, who is, one of the leads on 5th now, has no patience for anyone who's trying to exclude anyone from this game.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. One more question.
One more thing I was told that, and their figure is now that 40% of players are women now, by the way.
Those were way in the back.
Yes, all the way in the back. You, sir.
So, as D&D has evolved, it's been through a lot of different incarnations of it. With different feel, for whatever reason, right? As it was trying to chase a market. And what I'm wondering is, do you have among these different incarnations of D&D, its art and the rules and whatever? Do you have one that is your favorite that you want to kind of mention and talk a little bit about, or just say something about which one of its different eras?
Which edition or which piece of art? I'm sorry.
Eras, because some had like a more, bikini art versus, so I just want to kind of see, hear about which era of the D&D art or rules or game is your favorite, and just
Sort of the Errol Otis era.
Oh, Errol Otis.
Yeah, we love his art.
We just had him with us at Games of Berkeley, John?
Just a couple days ago.
Yeah, Sunday.
Do you guys
that's
just
circa 1980?
Do you know who Errol Otis is? Do you know the art we're talking about? Okay, so I mean, his art was extremely colorful, like it looked like something out of a.
It was exciting new colors and shapes that weren't as traditional. I think he's like the El Greco of D&D fantasy art. He's pretty, he's pretty awesome.
You can see his shove from Deities and Demigods, the first printing.
Do you have
if anyone knows the Mulvey box set, he was the one that did the cover of this particular iconic piece. No one does art like him.
Yeah, and he wasn't they weren't putting him in a box saying you have to draw this or do that. He was it was unhinged. They just let him be him. And I think that's what's beautiful about Dungeons and Dragons. It's like a catch-all for all. It's not like Lord of the Rings where it has one feel. It's a quirky catch-all where anything goes. And I think that speaks to the game, which is you bring your imagination. Your group can do it any way you want at any rating system, and you can take even our structured product and go off on a tangent and make it your own. And that's the beauty of it.
People like Errol Otis definitely encouraged that because there was a sort of brutal edge to his artwork, while at the same time whimsy and humor and all kinds of the main player characters always looked like a bunch of wackos, just really weird. If you look in the book and see any of Errol's stuff, or if you look it up on Google.
I like AD&D. I wasn't allowed to play it, but my older brothers played it, so I lingered like Elliot while they played and looked through the book and learned how to draw. And I love 5th edition because it's taken all these things I remember and repackaged them in a fun way, and I've gotten to play it with some new people. I've got my wife to try it. So it's pretty cool that at this point in the game, 5th is doing something that the other ones haven't, and it's really connecting. I think that's special, and I'm having the best time playing 5th edition right now, so that's...
And so with that, we are going to wrap, and I want to give a couple thank yous if we can, if you just indulge us for a moment. So firstly, thank you to Google for having us here. We are thrilled to be here, really. And then again, we want to, knowing that this may well be broadcast on Google Talks, we really want to thank, first of all the artists and the designers that made this game happen over 45 years. This is not our story. This is their story.
This is their yearbook.
This is their yearbook. I like that's good.
That's
I like
good.
that.
Did you just come up with that?
Yeah,
That was
really-
amazing.
Write that down.
That's why I'm here every once in a while.
WotC, Wizards of the Coast, has been an incredible partner. The access they gave us, the support, the ability to go ahead and publish this book, that was them. In tandem with Penguin Random House, 10-Speed Press, our publisher. They deserve an incredible amount of credit for really letting us do what we wanted to do. I mean, I can tell you this book was supposed to be a lot slimmer. And we really said, we can't tell the story unless you give us 450 pages, oversized, let's do it. And then a couple individual collectors. And again, I really encourage you, look in the back of that book and see those acknowledgments. These are the people that made this happen. People like Matt Coder, people like Bill Meinhardt, Paul Stormberg, Billy Galaxy, Ian Livingstone, Alan Groh. It's a long, long list. Those people deserve an incredible amount of credit. This could have never happened without them. So thank you to all of them, and thank you to you for today and your time.